For over a century, scientists told us nothing could survive down there. The pressure would crush any living cell. The darkness would make life impossible. The cold would freeze biological processes solid. They called it the azoic zone, the dead zone, a place where life simply could not exist. And then two men dropped into the void and discovered something that rewrote the rules of biology forever. What they found lurking in the nightmare of the deep was not death. It was life. Impossible, terrifying, beautiful life. The biggest scientific blunder in history. Let's tell you about a man named Edward Forbes. In 1843, Forbes was one of the most respected naturalists in Britain. The guy was basically the David Attenborough of his day, minus the soothing voice and Netflix deal. He spent months aboard a ship called HMS Beacon, lowering nets into the Aegean Sea and carefully cataloguing everything he caught. And here is what Forbes noticed. The deeper his nets went, the fewer creatures came back up. At 100 meters, he caught plenty of fish. At 300 meters, things got sparse. By 550 meters, his nets returned almost completely empty. So Forbes did what any good scientist would do. He drew a conclusion. He announced to the world that below 550 meters, the ocean was completely lifeless. He called it the azoic hypothesis, and for the next 25 years, the entire scientific community nodded along and agreed. Obviously, nothing could live down there. The pressure alone would destroy any living thing. Now, here is where it gets embarrassing. Other scientists had already found evidence that Forbes was completely wrong. In 1818, Sir John Ross pulled living creatures from 2,000 meters deep. But everyone just sort of ignored it. The azoic hypothesis was too elegant, too logical, too convenient. You know how this goes, right? Popular belief beats inconvenient evidence. It is like when everyone agreed the Earth was flat, or that your mum's meatloaf recipe was actually good. Sometimes we just believe what we want to believe. But nature does not care about our beliefs, and the ocean was about to deliver a reality check that would make Forbes look like he had been studying a swimming pool. In 1869, two British ships dropped their nets to 4,389 meters and pulled up creatures that should not exist. The dead zone was teeming with life. And the real question became not whether life existed in the deep, but how far down it actually goes. The discovery that changed everything. It was March 23, 1875. A wooden sailing ship called HMS Challenger was floating in the middle of absolute nowhere. No land was visible for 2,000 kilometers in any direction, only the endless Pacific Ocean stretching to every horizon. The crew was exhausted. They had been at sea for nearly 3 years, taking measurements and collecting samples. By that point, they had already made hundreds of soundings, which in 1875 meant lowering a heavy lead weight on a rope until it struck the seafloor, then hauling it all the way back up by hand. They did this in tropical heat and polar storms, day after day, for 3.5 years. On that day, they expected another routine measurement. They dropped the weight, expecting it to hit bottom at 3 or 4 kilometers. They would record the number and move on. At 3 kilometers down, there was no bottom. That was strange, so they kept going. At 4 kilometers, there was still nothing. At 5 kilometers, the weight continued sinking. For a sailor in 1875, this was deeply unsettling. Many still believed in sea monsters. Stories of krakens rising from the depths to drag ships into the abyss were common. The crew stood on a wooden deck, watching rope disappear into water that seemed to have no bottom beneath them. They tied on more rope, then more, and then more. Finally, at 8,184 meters, the weight struck something solid. The crew of HMS Challenger had just discovered the deepest point on planet Earth. Today, it is known as the Mariana Trench. It stretches for 2,550 kilometers across the floor of the Pacific Ocean like a scar on the face of the planet. At its deepest point, called the Challenger Deep, it plunges to 10,935 meters below the surface. But discovering the depth was only the beginning. Actually reaching that place would take another 85 years, and it would require 2 men daring enough to attempt something that should have been impossible. The planet eating itself. Before we drop into the abyss, we need to talk about why this impossibly deep hole exists in the first place. And the answer is genuinely terrifying. The Earth is literally eating itself. You probably learned about plate tectonics in school. The continents move around, blah blah blah, but here is the part they do not emphasize enough. This process is absolutely violent. The Pacific Ocean is surrounded by what scientists call the Ring of Fire. It is a 40,000-kilometer circle of destruction where 90% of all earthquakes happen and 75% of all volcanoes explode. We are talking about forces that can level cities and trigger tsunamis that cross entire oceans. Here is what is actually happening. The Pacific Ocean floor is being created in the middle of the ocean, where hot magma rises up and solidifies into new rock. This new seafloor spreads outward like a geological conveyor belt. But the Pacific Ocean is not getting bigger. So where does all that rock go? It gets shoved back down into the Earth. At the edges of the Pacific Ocean, the seafloor is being forced underneath the surrounding continents. It slides down into the hot mantle where it melts and gets recycled. Scientists call this subduction, and it is basically the planet's way of digesting its own crust. The Mariana Trench exists because the Pacific Plate at this location is 180 million years old. That makes it the oldest ocean floor on Earth. Old rock is cold rock is dense rock, and dense rock sinks like a stone. When this ancient plate meets the younger Philippine plate, something dramatic happens. The younger plate rides up and over, the older plate bends almost straight down, and that bend creates the deepest trench on Earth. The forces involved have produced geological features that sound like science fiction. There are mud volcanoes 50 kilometers wide, spewing chemicals into the water. There is a volcano that releases liquid carbon dioxide because the pressure down there is so extreme that gas turns to liquid. And there is an actual pool of molten sulfur sitting in a volcanic crater. You know the only other place in our solar system with liquid sulfur lakes? One of Jupiter's moons called Io. The Mariana Trench is not just deep. It is a window into processes that have been shaping our planet for billions of years. But the real question remained: could anything actually survive at the bottom? The craziest dive in history. Let's introduce you to 2 of the most insane individuals in the history of exploration, Lieutenant Don Walsh of the United States Navy and Swiss engineer Jacques Piccard. On January 23, 1960, these 2 men climbed into a vessel called the Trieste and attempted something that should have killed them. The Trieste was basically a tiny steel ball hanging beneath a giant tank of gasoline. That is not a joke. They used 10,000 gallons of aviation gasoline for buoyancy because gasoline floats and does not compress under pressure. The crew sphere itself was about 7 feet across. 2 grown men crammed into a space smaller than a walk-in closet for what would become an 8-hour journey into the unknown. They started their descent at 8:23 in the morning. The sphere sank slowly at first, then faster as the gasoline compressed. Outside the tiny portholes, the water changed from blue to black within minutes. They were dropping at about 1 meter per second into total darkness. At 9,000 meters, something terrifying happened. Bang! A massive explosion shook the entire vessel. Walsh and Piccard were thrown together by the impact. Alarms should have been going off in their heads. Something had clearly broken. They looked around frantically, trying to identify the damage. They could not find anything obviously wrong. So what did they do? They kept going. Let me repeat that. Something on their vessel had just violently failed at a depth where the pressure was already over 900 atmospheres, and their response was to shrug and continue dropping toward the bottom. What they did not know was that one of the outer window panes had cracked. A 15-inch thick piece of plexiglass designed to help contain pressure that could crush a nuclear submarine had just failed. They were operating on borrowed time in a vessel that was actively breaking apart. They dropped 3 more kilometers anyway. At 1:06 in the afternoon, nearly 5 hours after starting their descent, the Trieste touched bottom at 10,916 meters, the deepest any human had ever gone, the deepest any human would go for the next 52 years. And then, through the tiny portholes in the swirling sediment, they saw it. Movement. A flat creature swimming slowly across the seafloor. Life. At the bottom of the world. In conditions that every scientist had said would be impossible. Something was alive in the nightmare of the deep. Walsh and Picard had just proven that life could exist anywhere, but what they glimpsed was only the beginning. The creatures waiting in the darkness were stranger than anything they could have imagined. Journey through alien worlds. If you actually descended through the ocean to the Mariana Trench, you would pass through worlds as different as any planets in our solar system. Let me take you on that journey. The first 200 meters are the sunlight zone. This is the ocean you know from vacation photos and Finding Nemo. Warm water, beautiful light, colorful fish. About 90% of all ocean life exists in this thin layer. Also, this is where tiny organisms called phytoplankton produce half of all the oxygen you breathe. Every second breath you take comes from the sea. Below 200 meters, you enter the twilight zone and things get weird fast. The light fades from blue to purple to black. The temperature drops. But here is the crazy thing. This zone contains more fish than the rest of the ocean combined. The most abundant vertebrate on Earth lives here. It is called the bristlemouth fish, and there might be a quadrillion of them. That is a 1 followed by 15 zeros. At 1,000 meters, you enter what we call the midnight zone, because that sounds way cooler than bathypelagic. No sunlight has ever reached this depth. The water is a constant 4 degrees Celsius. The pressure would crush your lungs instantly. But it is not actually dark down here, because the animals make their own light. About 80% of creatures in the deep ocean are bioluminescent. They produce light through chemical reactions in their bodies. Blue light mostly because blue travels furthest through water. They use it to hunt and hide and find mates in a world without sun. The creatures here look like nightmares designed by committee. The anglerfish dangles a glowing lure in front of jaws filled with translucent teeth waiting for curious prey to investigate. The barrel-eye fish has a completely transparent head, so its tubular eyes can rotate inside its skull. The gulper eel has a mouth so huge it can swallow prey larger than itself. And we have not even reached the Hadal zone yet. Below 6,000 meters, named after Hades, the god of death, life becomes truly alien. And what scientists have discovered there is forcing us to completely rethink what life actually needs to survive. Monsters of the abyss. Then come some creatures that should not exist but absolutely do. The giant squid has the largest eyes in the animal kingdom. Each eye can grow to 30 centimeters across. That is literally the size of a dinner plate. They need eyes this massive to detect the faint bioluminescent flashes of prey in the eternal darkness. The largest specimen ever measured stretched 14 meters long. Scientists think they probably grow even bigger. At the very bottom of the Hadal zone, we find creatures that break the rules of biology. Xenophyophores are single-celled organisms that grow to the size of footballs. One cell, 20 centimeters across. Everything we know about cell biology says that it should be impossible. Apparently, nobody told the xenophyophores. The Mariana snailfish holds the record for the deepest living fish ever found. Scientists have filmed them at over 8,000 meters in depth. They look almost ghostly. Translucent pink bodies with no scales and skulls that are not fully formed. They survive by filling their tissues with a chemical that prevents their proteins from being crushed by pressure. And then there are the vent ecosystems. Around volcanic fissures where superheated water spews from cracks in the sea floor, bacteria have learned to harvest energy from chemicals instead of sunlight. Giant tube worms, 2 meters long, cluster around these vents. They have no mouth, no digestive system. They are essentially bags of bacteria that convert volcanic chemicals into food. These creatures have evolved for millions of years in complete isolation. But here is the thing that should keep you up at night. We have barely scratched the surface of what is down there. The last frontier. Here is a fact that genuinely bothers us. We have better maps of Mars than we do of our own ocean floor. As of 2026, only 27% of the seafloor has been mapped to modern standards. The amount humans have actually seen with our own eyes? About 0.001%. We know almost nothing about most of our own planet. Only 27 people have ever reached the bottom of the Challenger Deep. That is barely double the 12 who walked on the moon. More than 7,000 people have climbed Mount Everest. You can book a ticket to space if you have enough money. But the deepest point on Earth remains almost completely inaccessible. In 2025, Chinese scientists sent a submersible to the Challenger Deep 33 times. They discovered 7,564 new species of microbes. Here is the kicker. Nearly 90% of them had never been documented before. 9 out of every 10 organisms they found were completely unknown to science. Think about what that means. Every single time we look, we find things we have never seen. The deep ocean might contain more undiscovered species than all land ecosystems combined. And some of those species might hold cures for diseases we cannot currently treat. Marine organisms have already given us breakthrough treatments for cancer and chronic pain. Scientists estimate that deep-sea creatures produce more antibiotics and anti-cancer compounds than any group of land organisms. Every expedition brings back samples that could change medicine forever. So what do you think is hiding in the unexplored depths of our oceans? Drop your wildest theories in the comments below because, honestly, your guess is as good as mine.